Okay, cool. So welcome to Decoded, Understanding Tech Concepts in Government. Today is our first session, and as Jen said, we'll be having more sessions in the future. I want to tell you guys a little bit about what I am generally doing at the center, and also what my focus is and a little bit about my background. And then we'll hop into the agenda and go over some general concepts in technology. So for me, my title is Digital Services Analyst. I sit at the intersection between policy and technology. And my main goals are demystifying technical concepts, developing advocates' comfort with asking questions and navigating technical conversations. I want to provide resources and research to support our knowledge building. And then I really want to focus throughout all of that on human-centered design principles, which I'll talk a little bit more about later today, and also equity in general. My current focus is obviously this Decoded series, Medicaid unwinding, digital identity and identity proofing, which I'll also be talking about a little bit later, and AI, which I'll also talk about later. Let's see. So let's go back and look at this agenda. So we already went over our goals and focus. We're gonna look at some key terms and concepts. And then at the end of this, we're gonna go through a Jamboard. It's just 2 slides where you guys will be able to add sticky notes about concepts you wanna learn more about, things you might be confused about, things of such like that. So before we hop into our key terms and concepts, I wanna tell you a little bit about my background. So I've been at the center for about a year and some change, almost a year and a half. But before this, I was a software engineer at Code for America. Some of you might be familiar with their work. And I worked on 2 projects, Get Cal Fresh, which was focused on getting people SNAP. And then I also worked on Clear My Record, which was focused on record clearance and automating that process. Prior to that, I was an apprentice, which basically means I started off at Code for America from a non-traditional background. I didn't study computer science in undergrad. I was actually a history major. And I made the transition into tech, and it was a pretty big jump. I had literally never taken a computer science class, I'd never written a line of code, and then made a transition through a coding boot camp and became an apprentice at Code for America. The reason I mention that is to say that I understand what it's like to not know anything about technology and to kind of be thrown into this world and trying to make sense of things. And the number one thing I learned is that there's actually a lot of similarities, and the best way to learn about technology is to lean on things you already know. And as advocates, you have a ton of knowledge, so much knowledge, not only about the policy, but also about the impact technology has on people that are using services. And so my hope and my goal is to help you package the knowledge that you have in a way that is useful in technology backgrounds or in technology conversations, and to also give you the tools to advocate for yourself and for the people in your communities. All right. So the key terms we're going to go over today are human-centered design, agile development, application program interfaces, which are APIs, artificial intelligence or AI, and remote identity proofing. And the intention for this is just kind of give you a flavor of the concepts that might be popular, you might be hearing more about, with the idea that as we move throughout the series, we'll be able to dive more deeply into any of these concepts, depending on what people show interest in. So first off, we can start with human-centered design. Oh, and if you ever have any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat or raise your hand. We'll also have opportunity at the end of these key terms for you to ask any questions you might have. Cool. So human-centered design is an approach to designing systems and software that focuses on making products usable and useful. It focuses on the needs, experiences, and challenges of people using the product. It's sometimes called a lot of things: client-centered design, human-centered design, people-centered, user-centered. There's a bunch of X-centered design. There are nuances between each of them. For example, client-centered design, as the name suggests, is focused on clients of a service. User-centered design is specifically focused on the idea of someone actively using a website, but might not focus on their experience before or after using a product. But in general, human-centered design is intended to be holistic. So from start to finish, not just when I'm interacting with technology, but when I'm interacting with the service in general, what is my experience? How do I feel? What challenges do I face? And how can that be improved? Human-centered design is rooted in research that engages users to uncover personal stories, pain points, critical needs, and areas of improvement. There are a lot of tools that can be useful in human-centered design. For example, user research tools like journey mapping, which is the process of mapping out from start to finish someone's experience, is useful to illustrate processes that may be opaque to decision makers and or developers, software engineers who don't interact directly with users. Human-centered design is rooted in experiences of people using systems. In the benefit space, this might be applicants, helpers, and workers. So the question becomes, why advocate for human-centered design in government? Advocates frequently hear feedback on user experience that may not be captured by agencies. If you interact directly with clients, I'm sure you hear stories of things that are difficult for them, things that decision makers might not always know about. And it's an important way for us to capture that experience to make sure that the services we're delivering actually reflect people's needs. It also benefits us in cost and time savings and make sure that we're solving the right problems with big impacts. It helps us uncover issues as a pattern. So you may hear stories about things people find challenging, but with human-centered design, we can collect those things on a larger scale and paint a picture of major pain points for people so that we might create system shifts. There's also an executive order on customer experience that's largely rooted in human-centered design. And so it's not just a good idea, it's also literally part of an executive order. And that can help you advocate for these as you're having conversations with agencies. Next, we're going to talk about Agile, which you may have heard. But before we hop into that, I want to kind of compare it to what has previously or currently been happening in government. So you may be familiar with waterfall project management. And as this image here suggests, it's a pretty linear process with requirements leading directly to design, designs leading directly to development, leading directly to tests, to deploy, to maintenance. It's a pretty traditional way of doing things in government, but there are downfalls to this sort of process. The waterfall method does not allow for a lot of adaptability. It makes it pretty hard to make changes, either as policy changes or as technology expands. So for example, using waterfall methods means you may spend 18 months building a service that no longer meets government policy, can't work with the latest technology, and can't make adjustments as users' needs change. In contrast, we have Agile, which is generally an approach that I would advocate for. And we can go a little bit more into that in the next slide. So Agile development is a development approach that focuses on collaboration, cross-functional teams, and iteration. So when I say cross-functional teams, that means people from a variety of needs or backgrounds. It may be a project manager, it may be engineers, designers, advocates, all working on the same team to push a product or project forward. It was created as a software development framework, but can be applied more broadly to projects in general. So it doesn't just have to be used to build a website or build a phone app. It can also be used to generally push a project forward. Ideally, it delivers working software frequently with a preference for shorter timescales. So that may be a few weeks, a few months, but the concept is basically that it's a cyclical process where you make a plan, you design, you develop, you test, you deploy, meaning you make it usable, and then you review and you launch it out to the public. And once it's launched out to the public, you can collect information and go back into that process. And because we go through these quick cycles, a few months rather than a few years, there's opportunity frequently to make changes as policy develops, as technology becomes readily available, and as users present problems that they may be running into. So in agile development, working tools and software is the main measure of success. That's the number one priority, is does it work and can people use it? If they can't, then it means we need to go back into our cycle and make some adjustments. And in agile development and at regular intervals, teams reflect on how they can become more effective. This is often called a retro, where people will look back retrospectively and reflect on what they've done so far and what they might need to do to make improvements. So then the question is, why advocate for agile development in government? It can reduce the risks of wasting funding on failing or outdated projects. I'm sure many of you have experienced using a tool created by a government agency that just doesn't work well. It's difficult, it's hard to understand, it takes a long time, and it probably costs that agency a lot of money to make. So instead, by using agile development, we're better positioned to make good use of our money and good use of our time. It also allows growth with newer technologies. So as technologies become more available, or as governments allow use of certain technologies, they can be more readily inserted into tools that are being used, rather than this long, laborious, several years process to get small changes made. There's also more opportunity to incorporate user feedback. Like I mentioned in the human-centered design portion of things, it's important that we integrate what people are experiencing into the process. And in general, agile development is also the most common approach to product development in the private sector. So when we are collaborating with the private sector, it makes it easier and more effective collaboration. Cool. And again, I'm moving through this. If you have any questions or anything you're confused about, feel free to drop it in the chat or raise your hand. Cool. So we'll move on to APIs. API stands for Application Program Interface, but basically all the time people are going to use the term API. And an API, put simply, is code that enables two software programs to communicate and share information. And APIs require a specific format of data, which I'll explain a little bit more in examples. APIs are generally split into two parts. There's an API request, which is, here's the data you need in the format you want. I need X information back. And an API response, which is, based on the data I've been given, here is the information you need. APIs are used constantly, all the time in technology, particularly in the private sector. So if you did any Black Friday shopping, you may have seen at checkout, like put something in your cart, you go to checkout, and there's a little PayPal checkout button. You can click that, and if you have PayPal, it'll automatically connect your PayPal account with the information you put in and the right price. This is an example of a website using PayPal's API. Whatever website it is, let's say it's Target.com. Target didn't rebuild PayPal. They didn't build their own version of PayPal and write all the code for that. Instead, they had the information. Here's the person's address. Here's the amount that they spent. And they sent it as an API request to PayPal. PayPal received that information and sent back a response saying, cool, we used this credit card information. This person has paid. Another example of an API, if you've ever used Airbnb and tried to navigate around on a map, you know, there's all the stays, all the places you can stay at, and they show up on a map, and the map also shows, you know, landmarks and bodies of water or whatever. Airbnb didn't build their own map system. They used Google Maps API and sent information to Google Maps saying, hey, this person wants to go to this place. Can you send me back a map of Los Angeles? Google Maps sends back that map to Airbnb, and those images are overlaid on top. So like I said, APIs are used all the time. You interact with them very, very frequently. So the question is, why advocate? Good question. I see a question here. What's a common way that state human services offices might use an API? So we will touch on that. Thanks for tossing that up. So the question is, why advocate for APIs in government? So APIs are particularly useful when you're integrating two separate tools or software that are part of the same workflow. APIs allow us to access functionality without having to develop software from scratch, which means we have cost and time savings. APIs also allow agencies to have access to newer technologies that have already been vetted by outside sources. And using APIs can lead to a more organized and readable code base. So this is a little bit outside of the user-facing side of things, but as an engineer, if you're writing a code base, by using API, things are more organized, sort of like plug and play. And it makes it easier to go back and figure out if there are bugs or errors, what went wrong, and where it happened. It also makes it easier to audit. And APIs generally increase the effectiveness of services by allowing other groups to integrate with and amplify agency data and content. So back to the question here in chat. What's a common way that state human services might use an API? So there aren't, like, not all agencies are using APIs for their own services. And that is something that, like, ideally we would move towards, is having services accessible by APIs. But I can give you an example of something that in an ideal world would be happening. So let's say you're a state and you have both SNAP applications and Medicaid applications, and you want people to be able to submit information to both. In an ideal world, you'd have an API for your Medicaid backend. And when I say backend, I mean the parts that the user doesn't interact with. So front end is like, you know, the actual website where you click buttons, and back end is like data processing and all the sorts of things that I wouldn't see as a person using the website. So let's say I have a Medicaid backend and I have a SNAP backend. Those are separate APIs. I could have a Medicaid API where I can submit information to Medicaid, and I can have a SNAP API where I can submit information to SNAP. If I had both of those available, you could build multiple front ends that could connect to API. So for example, you could have one front end that has a combined application and submits information to both backends. You could have another front end that might, maybe community workers might be able to use to walk someone through an application or something like that. And in general, APIs let us access information without having to rebuild it. So instead of having to build a whole bunch of separate websites, you could just build separate front ends. Hopefully that answers your question. Also, if anybody else wants to share examples of APIs that they're familiar with, feel free to come off mute or drop it in the chat. Cool. Okay. We're moving along here. Okay, so next up we have algorithms, automation, AI. So in general, AI is super popular. I'm sure you've heard a ton about it. It's a frequent conversation, both in government, but also generally in society. But I think it's important to distinguish algorithms versus automation versus AI. Because often AI is used as this kind of umbrella term, but the implications of each are pretty different. So an algorithm is just a process or set of rules. Very simply put. Think simply like a logic tree or if-then statements. If I click this button, then I get taken to the next page. That's an algorithm. They can be a part of AI or automation systems, but they're not the same exact thing. Yeah, so algorithms are very simple concepts, but they can be made very complex. In the same way, logic trees, if-then statements can create very complex logic. If any of you have like, you know, philosophy or law backgrounds, you may be familiar with that. So next up, we have automation. And automation typically is used for repetitive and routine tasks. It is used for rules-based tasks, and it follows predetermined instructions. And automation happens frequently in government. For example, like if we're processing interim reports, that's a form of automation. But essentially, the important distinction is that automation is auditable and it follows predetermined instructions. So I know how I got from point A to point B, and I can track that. And I can also work backwards from point B to point A. Artificial intelligence, or AI, is an overarching term for the science and engineering of computers that mimic human-ish problem solving and decision making. Often in conversation, people will use AI interchangeably, even though they may be talking about a general algorithm or automation. However, the kind of concept that I think most people associate with AI is machine learning. And machine learning is a computer analyzing large volumes of data, and it's using statistical models to identify patterns in the data and produce some results. In general, it's the idea that the computer is learning like a human and adapting. And this is a much more complex idea that we'll get more into in a little bit. So there are a bunch of types of AI, many more than the ones that are listed here, but I'll kind of walk through some that are most relevant to the benefit space and that you might be most familiar with. So first up, we have biometrics. It's important to distinguish that like not all biometrics use AI. But in general, biometrics determines patterns in biological data like facial structure, fingerprints, or speech patterns. And biometrics is used often. You can think of like facial recognition that can be used in security, but also like on your phone if you have an iPhone that you unlock, or things like voice AI, which is essentially the concept of creating a unique signature for a person's voice. So I talk into a machine, it knows what I sound like, and next time I talk to that machine, it knows that it's me, Symonne. Next up, we have OCR, which is optical character recognition. Again, this is not always AI. It's been around for at least since the 90s, but in more current usages or interpretations of it, AI is used to improve accuracy. In general, OCR converts an image of text into a machine-readable text format. This is super useful, particularly when people are submitting renewals or applications that are like handwritten. So essentially, it takes a picture of a document or handwriting, let's say a filled out form that you took a picture of or you scanned. If you pass that through a machine that has OCR, it will spit back out editable and searchable text. So imagine now you can highlight it and copy and paste into a Word document or into Excel spreadsheet, and you have access to the data that was initially submitted as handwriting. Next up, we have predictive AI. Predictive AI uses data and statistical analysis to identify patterns, anticipate behaviors, and forecast future events. This is used really commonly in like business sector and in predictive modeling. In the benefits space, sometimes it's used to flag possible fraud based off of patterns. It is also used generally to predict markets. It can also be used to predict most effective messaging based on specific sectors or audiences. And then there's generative AI, which I feel like is talked about a lot because you might have heard of ChatGPT, which, spoiler, I did use ChatGPT to help name this series. So shout out to the robots. Generative AI is used for creating new text, images, writing, things like that. Tools you might be familiar with are ChatGPT, generative chatbots, or things like PowerPoint Designer. If you use PowerPoint, there's like a little designer button you can push that will reformat your page, and based off of the information you put in, make suggestions of icons that you might use. So feels my duty that if I'm going to talk to you about AI, I should also tell you about the general concerns and warnings about AI, particularly as it's becoming a more common conversation, both in government and in general. So the most important thing to remember about computers and safety and equity is that computers do what we tell them to, not what we want them to. And that's like one of the first things you learn in kind of software development is they don't make they do exactly what we tell them to do. So AI is only as good as the data it's given. The phrase is garbage in, garbage out. I see that question and I will answer in a second. So yeah, it's only as good as the data it's given. Garbage in, garbage out basically means if you give AI or any computer data that is biased or messy or dirty, meaning there's a lot of errors or inconsistencies, it's just going to compound upon those biases. So for example, if there's racial bias in your data, AI is only going to amplify that data. It doesn't have a moral compass. It doesn't understand the structures of society unless it's been given information that might help it understand that. So it often replicates bias. AI, specifically machine learning, or the type of AI that changes and adapts over time based off of data that it's been given, its decisions are not fully auditable. So earlier on, I talked about automation and how when we move from point A to point B, we know exactly how we got there and we can work backwards from point B to point A. With machine learning AI, we don't know how the computer went from point A to point B. There's an independent process in the middle where based off of data it was given, it made a decision. Because it's not auditable, it makes it harder to understand where issues are happening and where there might be flaws or points for concern. Particularly in government, agencies may lack internal AI expertise. So let's say an agency is presented with the idea of integrating AI into some part of its process. If an agency doesn't fully understand what's actually being suggested or asked, there may be unintended consequences of implementing AI, like bias or significant hindrances for clients that are using a process. There also can be privacy concerns. So AI uses large amounts of data, and the question becomes who has access to this data and who is using it and how do they use that data. For example, I don't know if you've ever Google search something like real quick, like, oh, I want a pair of blue shoes, like look it up. And then all of a sudden there's like ads for blue shoes everywhere. And you're like, how did they know? Like they're watching me. That's the idea that like a small piece of data can have longer or wider unintended reach. And that largely has to do with like privacy. So as advocates, as you're having conversations or hearing the term AI being thrown around by agencies or by vendors, it's important to keep in mind that AI is used as an overarching term. And the question to ask is, which type of AI implementation is being discussed? And what might the impacts or consequences of that implementation be? So generally in government, AI is going to continue to be a part of the conversation. Recently, there was an executive order on the safe, secure, and trustworthy development and use of artificial intelligence that was released. It's a big, like, overarching, talks about a bunch of stuff, but there's a section that is particularly pertaining to public benefits. That's worth a read if you want to look at it, but it directs agencies to create guidance around AI. So we'll be hearing within the next year guidance from agencies around the usage of AI. As I talked about earlier, OCR, optical character recognition, can be used to process paper documents and mail effectively, efficiently, and at a much lower cost. AI can also be used with chatbots to answer more complex queries, but I would say to proceed with caution and discernment around this, because as previously noted, the AI can create answers that might not always align with what internal desires are, meaning like agency or advocate desires. Okay, question here. Can you tell us how you use ChatGPT to help make this presentation? Yeah, sure. So I was trying to come up with a title for the series. I had a working title. I don't remember what it was, but I just didn't feel like it really was exciting. It seemed a little boring. So I looked up ChatGPT, and you can literally just like Google ChatGPT, and said, hi. I'm always like nice to AI. I feel like I got it, you know, I don't know. They don't have feelings, but maybe they do. I was like, hi, I want to name a series. It's for advocates, and I want to teach advocates about technology. Here's my working title. Like, how can I make it better? And it came back with a response. And basically, you can talk to it like a person, and you say, I want it to be shorter, or I want it to be funnier, or I want it to be more tech forward. And I did that for like a couple minutes until I came up with an answer that I liked. It came up with that Decoded thing, and I was like, ooh, that's cool. But I also talked to other human beings about it. My friend Farr here from the center, just to like gut check to make sure it sounded good. So in general, something I didn't add to the slide but wanted to is there's this idea of human in the loop, which means human in the loop is generally the concept that, like, if we are implementing AI, we want to make sure that at any major turn point, humans are involved in the process and basically say yes or no to a process moving forward. So this is a much more mild version of that. But yeah, could you explain the difference between open AI, API versus chat? I'm assuming it's open AI versus ChatGPT. I can't remember specifically if my understanding is correct. OpenAI is like a big umbrella branch, and ChatGPT sits underneath it. But I can get back to you on that because I can't double check right now. But generally, OpenAI and ChatGPT are generative AI, meaning that they can create words, images, things like that. Cool. Okay. How are we doing on time? Great. Okay. So next up, we have remote identity proofing, also known as RIDP. I'm only going to touch on this briefly. It's a really big concept that is, like, as advocates and agencies, we're interacting with a lot. And we will likely have another session about it in the future, but I just want to touch on it now to kind of give you a flavor of what's going on in the space. So remote identity proofing, or RIDP, is the process of collecting and validating sufficient information to uniquely identify a person online. It uses tools such as username and password, knowledge-based verification, or biometrics, which we talked about earlier. Knowledge-based verification is a verification method that requires people to answer multiple choice questions based off of private information associated with their identity. And this often comes from credit history. So if you've ever like had to go either through your bank or maybe through a government agency and they're asking questions like, have you previously lived at XYZ address? And did you have a blue Ford? And things like that, where you're like, this is kind of weird. That is knowledge-based verification. Remote identity proofing is increasingly common, particularly when accessing government portals. Although it does provide higher security, it can cause significant blockers for people with limited credit history or broadband access. Like I said, it's based off of your credit history. So if you're a person who doesn't have a credit history, or you've experienced identity fraud, then the questions that are being asked you might not be able to answer, or they might not be able to produce any questions for you at all. And the process to do remote identity proofing without a credit history becomes pretty complicated. Ideally, remote identity proofing would not be required before any type of application, like before a Medicaid or SNAP application, at least until there is a more equitable option. Because as you can imagine, people who are accessing government benefits are more likely to have limited credit histories or experiences, and also may have limited broadband access. Okay, cool. So that's the end of the key terms concepts section. I'm going to touch on a few resources. We'll go into questions, and then you'll have an opportunity to drop some sticky notes and let me know what you want to learn about next. Cool. So first up, I guess this is a shameless plug. At least, I don't know, you can read more if you loved listening to me talk for the last 40 minutes. It is a blog I wrote called CMS Required Tests, or a chance for advocates to improve the Medicaid online system. And it describes CMS testing and how it may be an avenue to shape state IT system improvement. There's the Benefits Enrollment Field Guide by my old friends Code for America. And it's an assessment that depicts what the online enrollment process looks like in each state with interactive maps and data. Super useful if you want to know more about your own agency's process, or if you want to compare it to other states. There is the Benefits Tech Advocacy Hub. It's a library of case studies. It's got a glossary, life cycle frameworks, and general guides for advocates to engage with benefits technology. It's super useful if you want kind of a touch point to learn more about key terms. There's the Digital Benefits Hub, which is an open source reference library for practitioners looking to improve public benefits access. It includes so many formats around technology, procurement, design, DEI, and more. So that's a really deep collection of information. And then there's a Digital Services Playbook, which is a collection of 13 key plays from private and government sectors that can help government build effective digital services. So these are, you don't have to read all of these like super in depth, but it's good starting points if you want to learn more. Cool. And yeah, look, people are dropping them in the chat, so feel free to click on those links there, and then you'll be able to access these slides later. All right, cool, we did it. Are there any questions about anything we've talked about so far? Feel free to drop them in the chat, Q&A, or come off mute. No questions? Oh, wait, 30 more seconds.
Oh.
Hi.
Oh, thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. I work primarily in the unemployment space, and we struggle with a lack of private vendors, right? Whether nonprofit or for-profit, that can do good agile development. There are a few, and they are kind of already fully engaged on many different projects. I'm wondering, what are some of the vendors you've seen in the public benefit sphere that have been able to do this well and with user-centered design, and whether what their capacity is for additional projects?
That's a good question. I don't have a direct answer for you, but I will say more. I think the vendor space is kind of changing as both agile development needs change, but also just generally like what governments need change. And I think you're right that like the sort of like more well-known ones tend to be overly impacted. I don't have insight into who is available and who's not. But I would be interested if anybody can drop in the chat any vendors that they've worked with or have experience with. And if there is kind of a wider interest in this, then maybe we can do a session on vendors, both like vendor management, but also like how you find the right vendors for your needs. Yeah, but thanks for that question.
No, that's helpful. Do you know, are there any states, or I don't know if Jennifer knows, if there's any states that have done a good job of building out their internal capacity to do this type of work that you'd hold up as an example?
So the best example I've seen is actually Idaho. They have brought a lot of their system and management in-house. And so they utilize like contractors, but working for state officials. So they're kind of managed by the state. They bring in these additional resources, but it's different than kind of handing over management of the system to a Deloitte or an Accenture or something like that. And they have some of those fancy titles of like chief innovation officer and stuff. They like had some of those folks before it was cool, and really led the way. So everyone's a little surprised when we point to them as an ideal example, but we've seen some really good things from there.
They also designed their own unemployment system with a 9-person internal team. So it seems like that might go across government for Idaho.
There's something they're doing right there. Yeah, for sure. But I think your question is a good one, because I think one of the challenges is that the big vendors co-opt these hot button terms, like, oh, you want human-centered design? Sure, we can do that. You want agile? Yeah, we do agile. And like whatever it is that you're asking for, they say they can do, but they might not be doing it as effectively as we'd like. And I think that's why subbing to others or bringing other people in a more modular way can be advantageous. So curious if other people have thoughts or experience in this area. I see Minnesota and Colorado have also hired in-house staff with roles that correspond to agile. Okay, those are more good examples. Great, thanks.
Yeah, I wanted to add, I know a number of different states have recently spun up digital services groups that are much more familiar with Agile, but maybe aren't fully integrated into state centralized IT agencies or the IT functions within state human services agencies or departments of labor. In the case of UI, I also love to point to the way that UK structures their tech management through the digital service standard, which I'll drop a link to in the chat, but the team at gov.uk I think does a great job of kind of enforcing Agile on projects.
Thanks for adding that. Okay, I see a question in the chat, and then if you guys see some people are off camera, so feel free to ask your questions. It says here, given that our state is completely in the grips of Deloitte, what room is there to get them to adopt more agile processes? It's a good question. And I think it's something that we're trying to figure out. Like, I don't think I have a gold standard for how to do that. But in general, I think it's useful to, as you're like collecting information about user experiences, meaning like clients are telling you what they're experiencing firsthand, finding ways to connect that or collect that like on a larger scale and matching it up with data. So an example of this might be in Medicaid unwinding, we hear a lot about call centers, and maybe we're hearing examples of people having really long wait times on the phone. But having that anecdotal experience, a direct quote from a client or something, but also being able to line that up with data that's being reported out about call center wait time. But it is a good question about like how we attempt to make change with these kind of massive systems. Jen, did you want to add anything to that?
I would just say I hope that the possibilities are wider now than they were before. I think when states had to replace their entire legacy system, especially by a very tight deadline, it was hard to think of being agile and modular in that because it was so big with so many moving parts. Now that that's been done in most states, I think there's opportunities to pick off parts of that and make improvements and go with different vendors or a variety of vendors and set up more of this interoperability using APIs and things like that, so you aren't as beholden to the single vendor. Also, we are seeing a number of states that are transitioning vendors. They may have had Deloitte build their system, but then somebody else won the M&O contract 5-6 years later. And so how that is happening, how that vendor handoff is happening, and how that could open things up that you're not locked in with the same vendor for all of eternity or for the life of the eligibility system. So a lot of lessons to learn as that evolves.
Cool, great. Are there any other questions?
Jacob has one on the chat and I think was
Oh,
on here too. So
Um,
are there any good resources for legislators or other policymakers who may be a little less tech savvy to help them understand the importance of agile development and some of these other basic practices during the procurement process?
yeah, for sure. So I mean, I think a space like this is useful. But I also think that there's a lot of good information in, let's see if I can get back to it. In the Benefits Tech Advocacy Hub, they have some pretty useful like glossaries that I think can walk through the process. There's also Code for America actually has something that talks about their user research kind of principles, and I think it does a good job of describing like how we might integrate UX. Yeah, and then there's also like playbooks that talk like this digital services playbook that walks through processes and kind of explains the value of implementations like agile or human-centered design or things like that.
That's helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for asking. Are there any other questions that have been written so far? Sorry. No? Cool. Okay, we've got a few more minutes left, like 5 minutes left. And in this last little bit of time, we are going to walk through a Jamboard. So just a quick overview. Jen, do you mind dropping the link to the Jamboard in the chat? Thank you. We're just going to go through 2 questions. The first is, what are technical terms you hear often and want to know more about or find confusing? And the second is, looking ahead, what technical concepts or problems will most impact your work in the next year? So it's toward 2 kind of categories. First, what do you want to learn more about in general that has to do with tech and policy? And 2, what's going to most impact your work? And your answers might be the same for both, but those are the questions we're going to do. I'm going to stop sharing so you'll have the opportunity to kind of look at your Jamboard and play some music if I can figure it out.